We may or may not get to that. But I want to look at the ontological argument because philosophically it's interesting. And the thing is, when I was in grad school, and even when I was in college, there was a newer version of this argument that appeared in the philosophy journals that totally revived the debate over whether or not it may work after all. The argument is interesting because, I mean, suppose you had a classmate. Suppose you're doubting God's existence, or you're an agnostic, or maybe even an outright atheist. And your roommate or friend Coppin says, you know what? You need to believe in God. And I've got a proof that's as solid as any proof in geometry or algebra or mathematics that shows that you absolutely must believe in God, and that to deny God's existence would involve a contradiction for you. Well, you know, you might be a little wary about that, but that's exactly what the ontological argument claims to do. It claims to prove God's existence with the absolute certainty of a mathematical proof, like a proof in geometry. And so, not surprisingly, rationalists like Descartes have liked this argument. And so it goes from the mere concept of God to a claim that the being who fits that concept has to exist. And as I say, debate over this argument has been revived. Some people thought that Immanuel Kant put it to rest in the 19th century. Immanuel Kant basically tried to shoot down every other philosophical argument for God's existence in order to get out his own. At least that's my own assessment of the situation. But it was restated in a way that got around Kant's objections to it. And there are two things you want to keep straight here. It's one thing to ask whether or not you believe in God, or whether or not somebody believes in God, right? It's a totally different thing to ask whether you think that a particular line of reasoning, that a particular argument that somebody claims proves God's existence really does the job. See, one of the people that, St. Anselm of Canterbury first got out this argument, and as I say, there weren't many original things in the Middle Ages, but this was one of them. The other notable thing was Occam's razor, which we're not going to worry about, but that came up in the debate over universal essences. And William of Ockham said, well, the best way to look at it is that they exist only in name, that they don't really exist. And that we ought to adopt theories that keep the assumptions about what exists down to a minimum. And this has come down to us as Occam's razor. You know, the simplest theory is most likely to be correct. And also the theory that has the simplest view of the world, the theory that assumes the least in terms of what exists. The 20th century philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, talking about Occam's razor, said, you know, I like desert landscapes. I don't like to make a lot of assumptions about things that exist. He says, somebody might criticize me and say, you know what, there are more things in heaven and earth than are in your philosophy, Professor Quine. But Quine says, that doesn't bother me at all. What bothers me is whether or not there might be more things in my philosophy than are in heaven and earth. In other words, whether I'm making assumptions about things that exist that don't exist. You know. So Occam's razor was another very original thing that came out of the Middle Ages, along with the ontological argument. And so Occam's razor would say, keep our existence assumptions down. But we're going to see that Descartes used a version of this next time. Well, Aquinas and other people, Pardon? Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Kind of washes things out, doesn't it? That's good. Well, Aquinas did not care for the ontological argument. He liked a posteriori arguments from observations about the world, and the argument from first cause, the cosmological proof, the design argument. Both those arguments depend first on making observations about the world. Things cause one another in this world. There is evidence of what seems to be design in this world. Whereas the ontological argument tries to go from, okay. In other words, Aquinas, and again, this PowerPoint has been on Blackboard for about a week and a half, 2 weeks, since before the break. So Aquinas liked arguments that were a posteriori, but the ontological argument is a priori. It goes from the mere concept of God. The word ontos, there's a whole branch of philosophy called ontology that Aristotle said deals with the issue of being qua being, of existence itself. And so the word ontological comes from this Greek word for existence, or being with a capital B. In other words, it moves from a concept of who God is, of God's existence, to the claim that the being that fits that concept has to necessarily exist. So it's not based on sense observations, but moves from concepts alone. And this is kind of an interesting thing. Could we prove, simply from the concept of God and who God is conceived to be, without any other assumptions, that God exists, with the certainty of a mathematical proof? Well, you can see for people who thought you could do this, I mean, there's a real fascination with thinking that this might be possible. So what concept of God does Anselm work with? Well, think about it. The traditional concept of God, as the author of all that exists, as the being who is all-powerful and all-knowing and morally perfect and everywhere. Well, you can say, well, if we consider God as traditionally thought of, I mean, what could be greater than God? And so this is kind of the concept that Anselm of Canterbury was working with, that God is a being than which none greater can be thought. In other words, that God is the greatest being we could imagine or think of. Now, what he tries to do, this is his strategy, he tries to say, well, you know, if you'll agree with me on the concept of God, I can show you that a being that fits that concept has to exist as a real being. can't be just a concept in our minds. Now, Anselm is not trying to bully people. He's not trying to be a name caller. When Anselm talks about the fool and refers to the person who does not believe in God, he's quoting Scripture. I have the references in back of me. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So Anselm thinks that if he could get somebody who denies God's existence to at least agree on the concept of who God is, then he can take them, by using the ontological argument, to the conclusion that God, as is conceived in that concept, must exist. Now, of course, to agree on the concept of God would be a lot easier in Anselm's day, right, where he's talking about the concept of God in what is basically a Christian, Roman Catholic Christian country, right, in the Middle Ages, might be harder to get someone in our pluralistic environment to agree with you on who God should be conceived to be. But if we think about the traditional attributes of God, certainly God would be a being than which none greater could be conceived. So how does he proceed then from this? Well, what is the atheist doing? Well, the atheist is denying the existence of that than which none greater can be thought. And the question that Anselm's proof raises is, can the atheists do this without contradicting themselves? So you have to first assume that the atheist would agree, or the agnostic would agree with Anselm, that God exists at least as a concept, and that they would agree on the concept of who God is, that God is the greatest being we could think of. And he says, well, this is essentially the point of view of the atheist or agnostic, that God exists as a concept in our mind, but not in reality. But now Anselm, Anselm buys into some Platonic assumptions without telling us he does. Remember, for Plato, to exist is better than not to exist. We didn't go into the whole hierarchy of the forms, but he thinks that eternal forms have a higher existence status than things like rocks and trees and desks and things that come into or go out of existence, and that these have a higher existence status than images of them, like the images on the cave when we looked at the allegory of the cave at the beginning of the course. So for something to exist means it's somehow greater in status than something that does not exist. And he makes, this is what I put in this slide, is essentially Anselm's own point here. He says, well, look, consider a painting. Isn't it greater for a painting to exist after it's been painted in reality than for the painting before it's painted to exist only as a concept in the mind of the painter? Isn't it better for it to exist in reality? And so Anselm says, well, wouldn't that be the case then with God? Wouldn't a being that exists in reality be greater than a being that exists solely as a concept in the mind, So he says if that's the case, and here we're back to talking about the greatest being we can think of, that than which no or none greater can be thought, if, as the atheist claims, that than which none greater can be thought existed only in the mind, then there would be a greater, namely a being conceived the same way it existed in reality. So a being that existed only in the mind as a concept can't really qualify as the greatest being we can think of. In order to qualify as that than which none greater can be thought, that being has to exist in reality as well. Well, you see where he's going with this, right? He says, well, if you're going to agree with me as an atheist that God is the greatest being we can think of, but now I'm showing you, Anselm would say, that in order to qualify as the greatest being we can think of, that being would have to exist in reality, and not just as a concept in the mind, just as a painted painting existing in reality is greater than just a painting as it's conceived in the mind of a painter. If I've shown you all these things, then you would have to admit that in order to qualify as the greatest being you can imagine, God has to exist in reality and not as a concept in the mind. So you'd be contradicting yourself on the one hand to conclude that God is the greatest being you can think of, and also to claim that that being exists only in the mind and not in reality. Now, at this point, I like to say that this argument, now I may have lost some people here, and that's okay. This is what I call either an expressway argument or a shower argument. In other words, it's one of those things where you can say, you know what, Prof. Morawski went over that ontological argument the other day in class, and man, I have no idea where that thing's going, you know. But then all of a sudden you're lathering up in the shower, and then you're thinking, oh, let's see, that than which none greater can be, has to exist. Oh, yeah! I said, you know, all of a sudden it just hits you, you know, like eureka, you know, or you're stuck in traffic on the expressway, and you're bored and you're thinking about the ontological argument, as most of you would be on the expressway, rather than the person who just cut you off. And all of a sudden it just hits you, you know. So sometimes it's hard to feel the force of this argument, but then at some point it just kind of dawns on you where this thing's going. So don't worry if you don't quite follow it the first time you hear it. Well, so if we can think of no greater being than that than which none greater can be thought, then that being has to exist in reality and not just as concept in the mind. So from the mere concept of God as the greatest being we can imagine, Anselm says, I've just shown you that in order to qualify as that, God has to exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. So if you agree with me that God is the greatest being we can imagine, you also have to agree with me that God exists in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. In fact, you'd be contradicting yourself if you agree that God is the greatest being we can think of or imagine, and you still hung on to this notion that God exists only as a mental concept and not in reality. So that's kind of where Anselm went with that. Now, so he says, here's the conclusion, that God has to exist in reality in order to qualify as the greatest being we can think of. Otherwise, we could think of a greater being, one that existed in reality and fit that concept. So, the fool then has to admit that God exists not just as a concept in the mind, but in reality as well. Now, how does this... So you can see that this is an argument that is intended to prove God's existence with the certainty of an axiom in geometry. If you agree on the basic principle that God is the greatest being we can think of, then that being has to exist. You know. Now again, it shouldn't surprise you that not everybody bought in to Anselm's claim that this argument works. And one of the people who did not buy into it was one of his fellow monks, a monk named Guanillo. And he tried to show that Anselm's reasoning has some kind of a problem with it. Using a technique that we teach to first-year logic students, sometimes, not always, it's what's called refutation by logical analogy. It's a wonderful debating technique, a wonderful way of shooting down somebody's argument if you're fast at thinking on your feet. What you do, basically, is develop a parallel argument that seems to follow the same line of reasoning as the reasoning of the person you're criticizing, but that either leads to something absolutely absurd or that seems to have real problems with it. And so you say, well, look, if your argument worked by the same reasoning, I could conclude X, and X seems to be absurd, so there must be something wrong with your reasoning. And this is the strategy that Guanillo used against Anselm to try to show that there's a problem here. Basically, Guanillo said, you know what, Anselm, I don't think your argument for God's existence works. And he says, instead of just talking about the greatest being imaginable, he says, there are a lot of things that we think are perfect. He says, imagine the most perfect island we can think of. And Guanillo said, you know what, Anselm, by your reasoning, I could prove from the mere concept of the most perfect island that that island must be out there somewhere. And doesn't that seem odd that from the mere concept of something like the most perfect island, I can prove that it must exist? So if I can do that, Anselm, wouldn't you say it shows that there's a real problem with the reasoning you've used to prove God's existence? Well, this was what Guanillo said. So if we, in other words, tried to develop a parallel argument to Anselm's, we said, well, look, the most perfect island can't exist as only a concept in the mind or just on a travel brochure, because if that were the case, then we could think of a more perfect one, namely one that existed in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. So if we're dealing with the most perfect island we can imagine or think of, that island must exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. But again, if it seems odd that from mere thought alone, from the mere concept of the most perfect island in our thought, we should be able to prove that it's somehow out there somewhere, then he says, isn't it better to question the reasoning that seems to lead us to a result like this as questionable? And if that reasoning is the same reasoning, Guanillo, that you've used to try to prove God's existence via the ontological argument, mustn't that show that there's something wrong with the reasoning in the ontological argument? So this was basically Guanillo's strategy. And Anselm's reply to it has never been very satisfying to me, but Descartes seemed to think it was worthwhile. Basically, his reply was that somehow the case of God is unique, and that the argument really does not work for something like the most perfect island, but it does work in the case of God, who's the greatest being conceivable. Well, I've always found it hard to see how you can draw that distinction. But Descartes kind of runs with a version of this argument. Remember in the Meditations, when we were looking at, after Descartes finds his one certain truth, the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Remember, I tried to paint in broad strokes where he tries to go from there. And he tries to get back everything he criticized at the beginning by first trying to prove God's existence and then showing that, call you in a couple of minutes. I'm in class. Okay. What are friends for? All right, folks. Now, again, as I've said before, don't do as I do as I say do, right? Like parents say to kids, don't do as I do as I say do. Don't have your friends calling you in class. All right, back to the ontological argument here. All right, what are friends for? The point that I want to make is that at the point where Descartes finds the cogito, the only thing philosophically he knows for sure is that he exists, right? I think, therefore I am. So where he next tries to go from there is to try to prove the existence of a God who's no deceiver, who won't deceive us about things like that there's a real material world here. But how is he going to do that? Because he can't use a posteriori arguments that depend on observations about the world, like the argument that says God is the first cause of the world, the cosmological proof, or the design argument. Because the argument that says that God is the designer of the world. Well, because at this point in Descartes' reasoning, he doesn't even know that the world exists, right? All that he knows is that Descartes exists. So he can't use arguments that depend on observations about the world. So one of the arguments he uses, and it's not the only one, but we're not going to worry about some of the others, is a version. He gets out his own updated, new and improved version of Anselm's ontological argument. But the concept he works with there is God as the most perfect being we can imagine. And unlike the most perfect island, God possesses all perfect qualities. And Descartes' main move in the argument is to say that, you know what? existence is one of those perfect qualities. Something that exists is more perfect than something that doesn't exist. Hence, from the concept of God as the most perfect being, Descartes says, I can prove to you necessarily that God exists. In the same way that it's necessary for a triangle to have 3 sides and 3 angles. So we'll look at Descartes' version next time. Again, this PowerPoint is there. For some reason, I thought it would be brilliant to combine Aquinas arguments and the ontological argument in the same PowerPoint. I really need to edit them out and make them separate. But the PowerPoint deals with Aquinas arguments, but it's on the ontological argument as well. So we'll look at that. Again, up until the last day of class, I'll accept any of the extra credit options. Remind you find them in a folder in Blackboard titled Extra Credit Options. Somebody asked me that in the other class. Where are they? There are a lot of them in there. You can do up to 2 of them. They do not have to be typed. They can be handwritten. Most of them require your viewing a video, half an hour to 45 minutes, and then writing a short half a page to a page reflection on some of the points that were made in the video. I'm not asking you to summarize the whole thing or anything like that. So you can do up to 2 of those. Okay, we'll continue on. Again, somebody said, when am I going to give you the take-home stuff? Probably Friday, since your exam is Friday the 13th, a week from this Friday. So I need to get something to you by Friday. So, okay, take care, and we'll see you on Wednesday. And we'll continue with Descartes' version of this argument and Immanuel Kant's case against it.